Hello, CardsChat. Welcome to the first ever video edition of Strategy Snacks. I was doing a little play-along lesson with one of my students today who wanted to watch me play some of the game that she plays on WSOP.com, which is 50 NL. So this is 25 and 50 cent blinds in the Nevada side of WSOP.com. And we had a couple of notes on a few people that they were aggressive, and one note that I had from the past on a player who was tight. But these two had just been taken during the session, and I don't have actual notes. I just have these images attached to them, which is what I do when I suspect somebody is a particular style. And these players are both aggressive. So we started with $50. We've chipped up to $72.65. We ran pretty good in this session, which I always like when I have students. Get a pair of aces on the button. We get a raise from the rock, which is great. We know that we are crushing a raise from a rock with aces. In fact, have more equity against his raising range than we would against a softer player because he's got all those big card hands. And we're going to be able to easily read his ranges, right? So we actually like that when we have a pair of aces that this player's tight. And then a call from the aggressive player, which tells me he doesn't have a big hand. People in these games don't call a raise very often with a big hand in the first place and get that kind of tricky because they get punished for it so often. So the Great Dane's range is what we call beheaded. He doesn't have aces, kings, or queens. He probably doesn't have jacks or tens or ace-king. May not have ace-queen in his range here either. These short-handed no-limit games, ace-queen is a three-betting hand for almost everyone. So he's got a hand. He's got a hand that is somewhere in the middle. He's got something from ace-jack to a suited ace to a small to medium pair to a hand like queen-jack suited or some smaller suited connector. Hands like ace-10 might call here for some players. That kind of range. When we think about three-betting size here, a lot of people three-bet too big. The stacks are deep. They really don't want to get their hand cracked, but we're here to make money, not to win pots. We want to make the most money, and that means a more reasonable three-bet size. So we go to just shy of $6. It's still 4x the raise, and it would have been smaller than that if there hadn't been a caller. But since there's a caller, we go to 4x. If this was just if the Great Dane had folded and we just had this raise from a rock, we would have three-bet to something like $4.50 probably in this spot since the stacks are deep. $4 if the stacks are shorter. Most of that kind of play is solver approved, though. Sometimes solvers will recommend significantly bigger three bets, especially out of position. Sometimes they'll tell you to go to $8 here. But this is my standard way to deal with this. If I'm going to three bet the in position with a raise and a caller, I'm usually going to go to right around 4x. We get a fold from the rock, which I expected would happen a lot. He's not a complete rock that we know of where he's ultra tight and we're short-handed. He's going to be raising a reasonable range of hands here, at least top 10%, probably a little bit wider than that for a typical rock in these games. So he's going to be folding, way more than half the time here. And since I played with him in the past, he may have notes on me and not want to play with me. The Great Dane calls, which is not terribly surprising. If he had a hand that he thought would be good to see a flop against this guy, my raise is probably not big enough to punish him enough to scare him away and not want to see a flop now. So he wants to see a flop with us. And the second time he doesn't raise just tells us that much more about his hand. That it's a little less likely to be a hand like ace-10 offsuit here. A lot of people would fold that, even aggressive players, even loose players. And it's more likely to be a hand that flops well. So suited connectors, small pairs, things like that. This is a great flop for us. We're not really worried about kings, right? We don't. He would certainly have told us he had kings before now. I'm not too worried about tens. I think tens would have three bet most of the time from an aggressive player. I'm not seeing a flat from tens there very often. Threes is a possibility, but if he's got threes, good for him. Because a lot of other hands are possible. It's much more likely that he has a hand like king, queen, or king, jack suited, that he has Queen Jack, that he has 10-9 suited. You know, there's lots of other things that he could have. He could have a pair of 8s or 7s or 6s or something. You know, the vast majority of his range is still drawing really thin against us. So what a solver usually recommends here is a very small bet, and I find this is one of the places where I agree with solvers almost all the time in terms of, you know, the GTO play being also the exploitive play. A solver, most of the solutions that I do run against another player who's playing perfectly, right? You can run against a specific range, but it takes a lot more work, and it doesn't help me much here, right? It would maybe be interesting to, if I had a better feel for who this player was really and what their range is, to run against that range, but it's a lot more work. When the solver recommends things like a quarter pot or 20% pot here, I generally think that's correct. Most people are making their continuation bets just too big, and that is rewarded because you win the pot and you feel like, hey, I won. And you get that psychological reward that is not the same as the monetary reward you get from making the right decision. When you bet here, you're going to get called a lot, but that's okay if you bet small. If you bet small and you get called, you're just getting calls from very weak hands that have very little equity against you. So if I bet 40 or 50 or 60% of the pot, a hand like King Jack or Queen Jack or Ace 10 is likely to still call me, but a pair of 4s won't call me. 10-9 may not call me. Jack 9 of hearts may not call me because they just don't feel good enough about their hand, and those are hands I really want to call. So I bet about a quarter of the pot, and we get the 8 of diamonds. Now I ran this spot because I knew, and we actually talked about it in the lesson, that what I'm doing here is very exploitive and probably not GTO. So I actually ran this spot. I think that I made the right play, but that doesn't mean that it's the solver approved play, right? I made the right play against this opponent in these types of games. I'm not facing GTO perfect players in a 50 NL game. So I ran it, and here's what that looks like. I used GTO Wizard because it was simple and easy. And I went through all the bits until right here at the turn and deciding on a turn bet. This graphic, basically these colors are the key. You know, checking is green, all in is the deeper red. So the bigger the bet, the deeper the red is. And it gives us this graph. If we have X hand, we should do X thing. And so it says we should check Jack 8 suited all the time. It says we should check Jack 10 suited almost all the time. That we should occasionally bet it when it's Jack 10 of clubs. And it says that we should be betting aces almost all the time. It says that when we have the ace of diamonds, we can check 38% of the time. But that when we have aces without the ace of diamonds, we're almost never checking. It says we should be betting here. And usually betting either a fifth of the pot or half the pot. Right? Almost all of these say bet a fifth of the pot or half the pot. This says betting really big with ace of hearts, ace of clubs here is acceptable, and the same with ace of spades, ace of clubs. So I know the solver is going to want me to bet here. And the solver is assuming that you're going to get called down light by a lot of other hands that would prefer to call you down. Get that little positioned a little better there. The solver will say that it's assuming your opponents are going to call down a lot lighter because they're GTO. They know that you may not have a hand here, so you have to put a little more heat on them, and that they're not going to bluff many rivers. Whereas I know with the player I'm facing, he's going to bluff a lot of rivers. We've seen this guy be pretty aggressive. If I bet big again here, he's very likely to fold, and I really don't want him to fold because I don't think he has hardly any equity. So I check behind. A diamond comes on the river. We're not really worried about a runner flush draw. It's possible. Maybe he hit it, but not likely. The 5 isn't particularly scary, and we weren't ever really planning on folding here anyway. If the king paired and you knew your opponent, you might be able to fold, maybe even if the 10 paired. But you'd have to really know your opponent to be able to fold in those spots. We checked here so that we could call a river bet. And he made the river bet we want, right? It's unfortunate if he makes a $5 river bet. Then you've got a tough decision about whether to raise or not. And I will often chicken out and just call. In this case, with the bigger bet, we definitely can't raise. Like, this is a super easy decision. We can't raise because he's not going to fold any hand that beats us. And he's not going to call with any worse hands because he wouldn't be betting the worse hands that he will call with this big, right? If he has a hand like King Jack, he's not betting this big. So if he's betting this big, he's really polarized his range. He either has a set, a flush, or he's bluffing. So we can't raise here because the bluffs will fold and the sets and flushes will call. And that's no good. It makes it an easy call. And we're still pretty sure we're ahead here. This is not a terribly scary board the way this is played out. So we call and win it against a bluff. So we kept in a much weaker hand here by betting very small on the flop, which is exactly what we wanted hands like Queen 9 to call us. We checked behind on the turn when he in fact only had 4 outs. That's great because that check behind gave him a 1 in 12 shot or so at making a hand that beats us. A hand that, by the way, we might have been able to fold. In this case, I don't know if we would have, but we might have been able to fold if a jack came. That's one of the scariest cards for us. It brings in King Jack and it brings in Ace Queen. It brings in a lot of hands that are in Jack 10. So it brings in a lot of the hands that we're worried about that might bet and doesn't leave him with nearly as many bluffs. So our check behind on the turn got us the $15, and our small bet on the flop also got us the $15. If I bet 3/4 of the pot here on the flop like most people do, I don't make that $15 because he folds. This is an aggressive player, not a complete fool, right? We don't have notes on this guy that say terrible, doesn't know how to play, will call anything. All we have on this guy is a bull icon that tells us he's aggressive. So there's no reason to keep betting there, and this is actually how we make the absolute most money in this spot. And I think it serves as a good example of not only why these very small bets on the flop work so well, but also how we can learn from solvers and then still not do exactly what they're telling us to do, right? We can use other information that the solvers that we haven't worked with. You can't memorize what to do in every spot. You have to learn from them, do the right things that you think will make you the most money given the knowledge you pick up from the solver. And this is true whether it's working with an actual solver, whether it's working with a bunch of pre-solves, whether it's just going through quizzes, whether it's working with a coach, whatever it is. These things are true. You want to pile up knowledge and then use it to the best of your ability, and not try to do exactly what a solver would do and memorize all the solutions. That's just not reasonable. So we make a nice profit on the hand, and we made, I think, the absolute maximum that we could have made on this hand, and that's what we want to be doing in every situation, right? I'm also curious to hear your responses. How do you think this hand went down? How would you have done differently? And also, is this a format you like for strategy snacks? The first 5 or 6 were just short articles, and people seem to really like them. But I'm going to do some of them as a video, and I'm curious to see how you feel about that format. So I will be back sometime in the next week with another strategy snack, and maybe some of your results your reporting will tell me if this is a format you like.